What begins as a private confrontation inside a wealthy home quickly turns into a night of brutal violence. A pregnant woman discovers secret messages, hidden money transfers, and a dark affair between her husband and his mistress. The confrontation spirals into uncontrollable blows until she collapses, beaten into a coma, lying in her own blood. The husband believes power and silence will bury everything, and he walks away without looking back. What he does not know is that one late-night phone call brings her two brothers rushing home, setting off a chain of truth prison bars and a courtroom where money no longer protects anyone. Let us know where you are listening from and what time it is. Leave a comment below. We would truly love to hear from you. Isabella did not intend to find anything that night. She had been looking for a document related to a medical appointment, something Edward had asked her to forward earlier that day. His laptop was open on the desk, unlocked, the screen still glowing faintly in the quiet room. She hesitated only a second before sitting down. Her movements slow because of the weight of her pregnancy. The first thing she saw was not a document. It was a message thread, then another, then a transfer confirmation. The names repeated. Edward, Vanessa. The amounts were precise, scheduled, deliberate. There were missed calls, answered calls, messages sent late at night and early in the morning. None of it looked accidental. None of it could be explained away. Isabella felt the air leave her chest. She scrolled slowly, her fingers trembling, her mind trying to reject what her eyes were confirming. This was not a misunderstanding. This was planning. This was secrecy, backed by money and coordination. When she closed the laptop, she already knew she would not be able to stay silent. Edward returned home less than an hour later. Isabella was still in the living room, standing with difficulty, one hand resting against the back of a chair for balance. She did not shout. She did not accuse him with emotion. She spoke plainly. She told him what she had seen. She told him she knew about Vanessa. She told him she knew about the transfers and the calls. She told him it had to end. Edward froze. For a brief moment, there was no anger in his face, only calculation and fear. He asked how much she had seen. He asked whether she had copied anything. Isabella answered honestly. She said she had seen enough. She said she would not protect a lie. She said she would speak to her family and to a lawyer if he did not stop. That was when his composure cracked. Edward began to pace, his voice rising, his words sharp and defensive. He told her she did not understand. He told her she was overreacting. He told her she owed him loyalty. Isabella did not raise her voice. She repeated herself. She said she was carrying his child. She said she would not allow deception to define their life. The argument escalated quickly. Edward accused her of threatening him. He accused her of trying to ruin everything he had built. His fear shifted into rage, the kind that comes from losing control rather than gaining it. Isabella tried to step back, but her body was slow, heavy, limited by the pregnancy. When Edward struck her, it was not calculated. It was reactive and uncontrolled. The force knocked her off balance. She felt her body hitting the floor at an angle she could not protect against. Pain surged through her abdomen, sharp and immediate. She cried out once, then tried to move, but her limbs did not respond the way they should have. Edward stood over her, breathing hard. He saw the blood. He saw her eyes struggling to focus. He saw that she was not responding normally. The reality of what he had done settled in, heavy and undeniable. This was not an argument anymore. This was serious. This was dangerous. For a moment, he did nothing. Isabella tried to speak, but the words would not form. Her vision blurred. The room tilted. The pain dulled into something distant and frightening. She felt herself slipping, aware enough to know she was losing consciousness, but unable to stop it. Edward understood the risk immediately. He knew she was pregnant. He knew what doctors were required to report. He knew what a call for help would trigger. He did not kneel beside her. He did not check her pulse. He did not call for assistance. He chose silence. Edward stepped back, ran a hand through his hair, and looked around the room as if searching for a solution that did not involve responsibility. He decided quickly. He gathered his personal belongings, moving with urgency, but not panic. He avoided looking at Isabella as he packed. He avoided making any decision that would tie him to the scene. When he was done, he walked to the door. He paused only once, his hand on the handle. Isabella lay motionless behind him, her breathing shallow, her body still. He did not turn around. Edward left the house that night. He drove straight to Vanessa. He did not call ahead. When she opened the door, she saw his expression and knew something was wrong. He told her only part of the truth. He said there had been an argument. He said Isabella had collapsed. He said he needed to stay there. Vanessa did not ask questions that would have forced answers. Inside the house, he had left behind, the silence deepened. The lights remained on. The rooms stood unchanged. Isabella lay where she had fallen unconscious, bleeding alone. No one checked on her. No one spoke her name. No call for help came from the man who had promised to protect her. Time passed without measure. The house, once filled with routine and conversation, became still. The sound of the door closing echoed long after Edward was gone. Isabella remained unmoving, her life suspended in that quiet space, unseen and unacknowledged. The door closed behind Edward, leaving Isabella's life drifting silently inside the empty house. Thomas Reed returned to the house later that night out of habit, more than instruction. He had worked there long enough to notice when routines broke. The lights were still on in rooms that were usually dark by that hour. Edward's car was gone. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, but abandoned. He moved carefully through the hallway, calling Isabella's name once, then again, keeping his voice low. There was no answer. As he stepped into the living area, he saw her on the floor. Her body was still, her position unnatural. For a brief moment, he froze, hoping he was mistaken, hoping she would move. She did not. Thomas knelt beside her, close enough to see the blood, close enough to see the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her skin was pale. Her eyes were closed. He did not touch her at first. He had seen accidents before, but this did not look like one. The marks were wrong. The placement was wrong. This was not a fall. This was violence. Edward was nowhere in sight. Thomas stood slowly, his heart pounding. He understood the weight of what he was seeing. Isabella was pregnant. Whatever had happened carried consequences far beyond an argument. He hesitated, his hand hovering over his phone. Calling for help meant involving authorities. It meant questions. It meant the end of his job. It meant crossing a line that people like him were often expected not to cross. He looked back at Isabella. She did not stir. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but it felt longer. Thomas made his decision. He dialed for emergency services, his voice steady but urgent. As he explained, there was a pregnant woman unconscious, bleeding, unresponsive. He gave the address. He followed instructions without argument. When the ambulance arrived, the sound cut through the quiet street. Paramedics moved quickly, professionally. They asked what had happened. Thomas told them he had found her that way. He did not speculate. He did not soften the scene. He watched as they assessed her condition, checking vitals, securing her airway, preparing the stretcher. Isabella was lifted onto the gurney with care. The sight of her body moving only because others were moving, it made Thomas's chest tighten. He followed them outside, his coat thrown on hastily, his mind focused on one thing only. She needed to survive. He rode with the ambulance, sitting near her feet, listening to the controlled urgency of the medical team. At one point, one of the paramedics spoke quietly to another about the fetal heart rate. The words were calm, but the meaning was not. The heartbeat was weak. Time mattered. At the hospital, Isabella was rushed inside without delay. Thomas waited just long enough to give his name and explain how he had found her. Then he was asked to sit. Minutes passed without information. When a doctor finally spoke to him, the news was serious. Isabella had slipped into a coma. They were doing everything they could, but the situation was critical. Edward was not there. Thomas watched the doors, expecting at any moment for Edward to arrive to demand answers to take control. He did not come. No calls, no messages, no inquiries. The absence was loud. Hours passed. Nurses moved in and out. Machines hummed. Isabella remained unconscious. Thomas sat with his hands clasped, replaying the scene in the house again and again. The longer Edward stayed away, the clearer the truth became. This was not confusion. This was not ignorance. This was abandonment. Thomas understood then that silence was no longer an option. He stepped into the hallway and took out his phone. He had never called Isabella's brothers before, but he had their numbers in an emergency contact list, something Isabella herself had insisted on months earlier. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the first number. David answered quickly. Thomas did not waste words. He said Isabella was in the hospital. He said she was unconscious. He said there were signs of severe violence. He said Edward was gone. Michael was added to the call moments later. Thomas repeated everything. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He told them exactly what he had seen, exactly what he had done, exactly what had not happened. There was silence on the line, the kind that comes when people are processing something they never imagined would be said out loud. Then questions came, sharp and controlled. Thomas answered each one. He told them the ambulance time. He told them Edward had not returned. He told them the doctors were concerned for both mother and child. When the call ended, Thomas stood alone in the hallway, the weight of what he had done settling over him. He knew there would be consequences. He accepted them. Inside the hospital room, Isabella lay still, surrounded by machines that measured what her body could no longer communicate on its own. Her condition was fragile, her future uncertain. But she was no longer unseen. 2 cities away, 2 brothers began packing without discussion. Whatever plans they had for the coming days dissolved instantly. Their sister needed them. Nothing else mattered. And in the quiet space between those 2 moments, a single phone call rewrote the course of everything that followed. David Carter answered the call in the middle of the night, his phone vibrating against the wooden table beside his bed. He listened without interrupting, his posture straightening as each sentence reached him. By the time Thomas finished speaking, David was fully awake. He asked only one question. Where is she now? Michael Carter was on the line moments later. David repeated nothing. Thomas did. He spoke carefully, choosing accuracy over emotion. Isabella was in the hospital. She was unconscious. The doctors were concerned. Edward was gone. There were signs of serious violence. Neither brother argued. Neither asked for reassurance. The call ended with a single understanding shared between them. They were leaving immediately. Within the hour, bags were packed, flights booked, routes mapped. There was no discussion about timing or inconvenience. Whatever lives they had stepped away from no longer mattered. By the time dawn began to thin, the night sky, they were already moving. They arrived at the hospital without ceremony. No one announced them. They signed in, followed directions, and walked the long corridor in silence. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly against polished floors. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Neither man spoke as they approached the room. Isabella lay still beneath the lights. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, their quiet rhythms marking time. Her face was pale, her body motionless except for the subtle movements enforced by machines. David stopped at the foot of the bed. Michael stood at her side. For a moment, neither of them moved. A doctor entered and spoke plainly. Isabella was in a coma. The injuries were severe. The pregnancy complicated everything. They were monitoring her constantly. The next hours and days would be critical. Nothing was guaranteed. David nodded. Michael asked specific questions. What had been documented? What had been observed? What could not be explained? The doctor answered carefully, choosing words that reflected both caution and concern. There were inconsistencies. The injuries did not align cleanly with an accidental fall. When the doctor left the room, fell quiet again. David exhaled slowly. Michael rested a hand on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch Isabella. Their reactions were controlled, measured, restrained. Panic would not help her. Anger could wait. They stepped into the hallway and began asking questions. Thomas Reed was waiting nearby. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy with responsibility. When David asked him to speak, Thomas did not hesitate. He told them everything, from the moment he returned to the house to the second the ambulance doors closed. He described how he found Isabella. He described the blood. He described Edward's absence. He described the decision to call for help. Michael listened closely. David watched Thomas's face. Neither interrupted. When Thomas finished, the silence that followed was different from the silence in the room. It was sharp, focused. Edward had not come to the hospital, not once, not even to ask questions. That absence confirmed what both brothers were already thinking. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accident. This was not something that would resolve quietly if given time. David spoke first. He said they would not confront Edward directly. Michael agreed immediately. Emotional reactions would only give Edward time and excuses. If the truth mattered, it had to be handled properly. Their objective was clear. They needed facts. They needed documentation. They needed to understand what had happened and how it could be proven. Justice required patience, not noise. They returned to Isabella's room briefly, standing together at her bedside. David promised quietly that she would not be alone anymore. Michael promised that whatever had been taken from her would be answered for. Then they left the room and began working. They requested copies of initial medical reports. They noted timelines. They recorded names. They asked who had admitted her. They asked who had spoken to emergency services. Each question was deliberate. Each answer was stored carefully. Edward remained absent. As the hospital settled into late-night quiet, the brothers found a small waiting area and began organizing what they knew. Thomas stayed with them, answering additional questions as they came. No one raised their voice. No one speculated without reason. By the time the clock passed midnight, something had taken shape. It was not yet an accusation. It was not yet an investigation in the legal sense. But it was a direction. A private inquiry had begun. David contacted trusted professionals. Michael began reviewing records. They did not act as vigilantes. They acted as men who understood process and consequence. Every step forward was taken with care. Inside the hospital room, Isabella remained unconscious, unaware of the movement unfolding around her. Outside, the world continued as usual, indifferent to what had shifted. But for David and Michael, the path was set. They would find the truth. They would protect their sister. And they would make sure that what happened in that house did not disappear into silence. The night grew deeper. The hospital lights dimmed. Somewhere in the city, life continued uninterrupted. But within those walls, something irreversible had begun. David returned to the house the next morning with a clear purpose. He did not enter as a grieving brother. He entered as someone determined to understand what had happened within those walls. The place looked unchanged at first glance. Furniture was in order. Nothing appeared overturned. The quiet felt staged, as if someone had wanted the scene to appear ordinary. He moved slowly from room to room, noting details without touching anything unnecessarily. The living area drew his attention immediately. The angle of the chair, the spacing between the table and the wall, the position where Isabella had been found. None of it suggested a simple fall. The layout did not support the explanation Edward would later try to use. David checked the security system panel. Several cameras were inactive during a narrow window of time the previous night. Not offline due to a power issue, not damaged, disabled manually. The timing matched too precisely to be coincidence. He photographed the panel and documented the timestamps. While David worked at the house, Michael focused on what Edward had always treated as untouchable. his finances, his data. Michael accessed records Isabella had previously shared with him for safekeeping information she had asked him to hold without explanation months earlier. At the time, Michael had not pressed her. Now the reason became clearer. The transfers stood out immediately. Regular amounts, consistent intervals, always to accounts connected to Vanessa. There were also deleted messages recoverable through backup data conversations that confirmed coordination rather than impulse. Michael organized everything, carefully labeling dates and cross-referencing times. Back at the hospital, the attending physician reviewed Isabella's case with increasing concern. The injuries documented did not align with a household accident. The placement and severity suggested force. This was noted in the medical report without accusation, but with clarity. The report was stored according to protocol time, stamped and preserved. Thomas Reed was asked to provide a detailed statement. He did so without hesitation. He described the condition of the house, Isabella's injuries, Edward's absence, and the decision to call emergency services. His account was consistent. It was precise. It did not change under repetition. Through timeline reconstruction, David and Michael established the exact moment Edward left the house. Surveillance from the neighborhood entrance confirmed the vehicle's departure. Cell tower data placed Edward moving toward Vanessa's location shortly afterward. There was no delay, no attempt to seek help. The sequence was clean. Michael continued tracing phone records. Calls between Edward and Vanessa increased dramatically in the days leading up to the incident. There was a spike immediately after Isabella was found unconscious. Messages sent and deleted. Short calls that ended quickly. Enough to indicate coordination without exposing content directly. When the brothers compared findings, a pattern emerged. Camera access disabled, financial transfers, message deletion, immediate relocation, silence toward the hospital. Each piece alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a chain of concealment. David and Michael agreed it was time to involve authorities, not out of emotion, but because the evidence met a threshold that required action. They presented the compiled information to law enforcement, including medical reports, witness statements, financial data, and digital timelines. Officer Rachel Adams was the first to formally review the materials. She had already documented the initial hospital intake and noted the absence of the husband. The new information aligned with her concerns. She escalated the case to Detective Daniel Moore. Detective Moore reviewed the file methodically. He asked questions. He requested verification. He compared timestamps. When he finished, he did not speculate. He authorized the creation of a formal case file. Captain Robert Lewis approved the next steps. The documentation met the requirements for a criminal investigation. The case moved from suspicion to procedure. By the end of the day, an official investigation had been activated. Edward was no longer directing the narrative. He was no longer controlling access. The system he had relied on to shield himself was now turning its attention toward him. Inside the hospital room, Isabella remained unconscious, unaware that the truth surrounding her injuries was being assembled piece by piece. Outside, the mechanisms of accountability had begun to move quietly, deliberately, and beyond Edward's reach. Edward stayed inside Vanessa's apartment, the curtains drawn, the television volume low. He did not sleep. He watched news feeds refresh on his phone, scrolling through local reports and social updates, searching for any mention of Isabella's condition. Every notification tightened his chest. Silence offered no comfort. It only delayed consequences. From the fragments he could gather, the situation was deteriorating. Hospital sources spoke carefully, but the words critical and unconscious appeared more than once. Edward understood what that meant. A pregnant woman in a coma triggered mandatory reporting. Doctors documented everything. Timelines hardened quickly once they were written down. The risk was no longer hypothetical. It was immediate. Edward reached for his phone and called his personal attorney. The call connected on the second ring. Edward did not waste time. He described an argument. He avoided details. He emphasized confusion and shock. He asked one question. What was the fastest way to contain this? The attorney listened, then responded with caution. The situation was serious. Any contact with the hospital could be interpreted as involvement. Any statement could be used later. If Edward was going to say anything, it needed to be consistent and limited. A simple explanation. An accident at home. No speculation, no elaboration. Edward accepted the advice without hesitation. He instructed the attorney to prepare a narrative. A fall, pregnancy-related dizziness, no witnesses, no immediate medical response because he had panicked. The attorney warned him that this explanation would be challenged, but Edward believed challenges could be managed. Money and influence had solved problems before. Vanessa sat nearby during the call, listening without speaking. When Edward ended the conversation, she asked what he needed from her. He told her plainly. Silence, consistency, no messages, no calls that could be traced. If asked, she was to confirm only that he arrived upset and disoriented. Nothing more. Vanessa agreed. She did not argue. She did not suggest alternatives. She understood that her own exposure depended on alignment. The transfers, the messages, the calls. All of it connected them. Protecting Edward meant protecting herself. Edward believed the most dangerous phase had passed. He told himself that no one would step forward. Isabella was unconscious. Her family was distant. Staff would remain loyal if given reason to. His own family would say nothing. They always had. His parents did not contact the hospital. His siblings did not ask questions. The silence held. Edward made a deliberate decision to avoid any communication with medical staff. No inquiries, no visits, no texts. Absence, he believed, reduced accountability. The attorney confirmed that distance could be framed as shock if necessary. Edward leaned into what had always worked for him: control through resources. He reviewed accounts. He checked balances. He reassured himself with numbers. Wealth created insulation. Power created delay. Delay created opportunity. But while Edward monitored headlines, the ground beneath him shifted. Evidence continued to accumulate without his knowledge. Medical reports were finalized and stored. Witness statements were recorded. Digital data was preserved. Financial records were organized. Each piece was cataloged, time-stamped, and verified. Law enforcement did not move loudly. They moved correctly. Officer Rachel Adams completed her documentation from the hospital intake. She noted the absence of the spouse. She recorded the condition of the patient. She attached physician observations regarding injury patterns. The file was forwarded. Detective Daniel Moore reviewed the material alongside additional information provided by the brothers. He cross-referenced times. He examined phone logs. He studied the gap between the incident and Edward's disappearance. The pattern suggested intent, not confusion. Captain Robert Lewis requested a full compilation. The documentation arrived complete: medical findings, digital records, financial transfers, witness statements, location data. The threshold was met. A temporary detention request was drafted. Edward remained unaware. At Vanessa's apartment, he refreshed his screen again. No alerts, no calls. He allowed himself to believe the plan was working. He rehearsed the narrative the attorney had outlined, repeating it silently until it felt rehearsed enough to pass. Vanessa brought him coffee. They spoke in short sentences. She asked whether he would return home. He said not yet. He wanted the situation to cool. She nodded. Edward told himself that if law enforcement had intended to act, they would have done so already. He mistook preparation for hesitation. Across the city, signatures were placed where they needed to be. Procedures were followed. Requests were approved. The file moved forward. By the time Edward finally set his phone down and leaned back against the couch, convinced he had bought himself time, the decision had already been made. He just did not know it yet. Police arrived at Vanessa's apartment just after sunrise. There was no warning call and no delay. Officer Rachel Adams knocked once, announced presence, and waited the required seconds before the door opened. Edward stepped into view, wearing the same clothes he had slept in, his expression tight but controlled. He did not resist when the cuffs were placed on his wrists. The sound of metal closing echoed sharply in the narrow hallway. Vanessa stood behind him, stunned, her hands raised instinctively as another officer stepped forward. She was informed she was being temporarily detained. Her protests came quickly, then faded as procedure took over. Electronic devices were collected methodically. Phones, tablets, a laptop from the bedroom desk. Each item was sealed and labeled. Edward watched in silence, his jaw set, his eyes moving, but saying nothing. As he was escorted out, Edward asked to speak with his attorney. The request was acknowledged. He was informed he would have the opportunity after processing. He nodded once, absorbing the shift from authority to subject. Both Edward and Vanessa were transported separately to the station. The vehicles moved through traffic without sirens, the weight of the moment carried quietly. Edward stared out the window, rehearsing nothing, now understanding that words would only complicate what had already been documented. At headquarters, they were separated immediately. Vanessa was taken to an interview room on the second floor. Edward was led down a different corridor. The doors closed behind them with finality. Vanessa's questioning began first. Detective Daniel Moore sat across from her, a recorder placed clearly on the table. He outlined her rights. He explained the purpose of the interview. He asked simple questions to establish baseline facts. Her answers were hesitant but cooperative. As the questions turned toward timelines and communications, inconsistencies surfaced. She corrected herself once, then again. Dates shifted. Call durations changed. She attempted to minimize her involvement, then contradicted earlier statements. Each inconsistency was noted without comment. Edward's interview followed a different pattern. He sat alone at the table, hands uncuffed, but posture rigid. When Detective Moore entered, Edward did not speak. The detective presented the facts calmly. Medical findings, financial transfers, disabled cameras, location data. Edward listened without reaction. When asked to respond, Edward declined. He requested counsel and remained silent. The decision was deliberate. He would not add to a record already heavy with evidence. As hours passed, investigators compared notes. Vanessa's account conflicted with documented data. Edward's silence did not erase timelines. The file grew thicker. By late afternoon, the prosecutorial team had been briefed. The evidence supported escalation. Charges were prepared. The prosecutor authorized continued detention pending arraignment. Edward was informed he would be held. He was escorted through a secured corridor to the holding area. The environment changed. Fluorescent lights replaced daylight. The air felt colder. The sounds different. Doors opened and closed with mechanical precision. Media coverage began almost immediately. A brief statement was released confirming an arrest in connection with a violent domestic incident involving a pregnant woman. No names were used at first. That restraint lasted less than an hour. Once Edward's identity surfaced, headlines followed. Images from earlier public appearances were replayed alongside footage of the arrest scene captured by a distant camera. The contrast was sharp. Influence reduced to procedure. Edward was transferred to the detention facility before nightfall. The intake process was efficient and impersonal. Personal items were logged and removed. He was assigned clothing. Instructions were given without explanation. The cell door closed behind him with a sound that carried weight. It was not dramatic. It was absolute. For the first time since the incident, Edward was alone without protection. No attorney, no assistant, no phone. The space was small and unyielding. The power he had relied on did not follow him here. Outside, the city continued. News cycles turned, conversations shifted. Inside the facility, time slowed to its own rhythm. Edward sat on the bench and stared at the wall opposite him. The narrative he had built unraveled completely. There were no explanations left to manage, only consequences to endure. He had entered a world where money did not negotiate, and silence did not control outcomes. And the door did not open again. Edward was placed in a shared unit, not isolated, not protected. The door closed behind him, and the noise of the block swallowed the silence he had known. Voices carried. Footsteps echoed. He stood still for a moment, understanding that nothing here would pause for his adjustment. Information traveled faster than he expected. By the end of the first day, others knew why he was there. Not in legal language, but in blunt terms. A man who had beaten his pregnant wife. The words moved from mouth to mouth without distortion. Each repetition stripped him further. Eyes followed him. Conversations stopped when he passed. He felt the space around him harden. Meals were quiet. Recreation time was not. He learned quickly where not to stand and when not to speak. He learned that silence did not mean safety. Isolation came without formal order. No one needed to announce it. Benches emptied when he approached. Cards were gathered up. The message was clear. He was not welcome anywhere except the narrow space assigned to him. Threats arrived as murmurs at first. A sentence dropped as someone passed. A look held too long. Edward tried to ignore them, telling himself it would pass, that procedures would intervene. But procedures did not reach into every corner. One night, in a moment without cameras, he was struck. Not publicly, not theatrically. It was quick and deliberate, enough to warn, enough to hurt. Guards arrived after, not before. Reports were made. No names were offered. The system recorded an incident without detail and moved on. Edward understood then that his status meant nothing here. There were no favors to call in, no doors to open, no assistant to send ahead. The privileges that had once insulated him had evaporated at the threshold. His thoughts began to unravel. Sleep came in fragments. He replayed choices, looking for a path that no longer existed. He counted hours. He measured time by meals and head counts. He waited for his attorney, believing presence would restore control. The attorney arrived, spoke briefly, and left. There were limits. Inside these walls, influence stopped. Outside, preparation continued. Edward asked about bail. He was told to wait. He asked about options. He was told to be patient. The answers were careful and insufficient. The realization settled slowly. Money could delay, but not erase. Silence could protect, but not forever. He had crossed a line that did not bend. Panic followed. His breathing shortened. His hands shook when he tried to hold them steady. He avoided eye contact, then noticed that avoidance marked him just as clearly. He began to sit alone, staring at the floor, trying to disappear in a place that noticed everything. He thought of the house. He thought of the night. He thought of how quickly he had left. Each memory pressed against him without relief. There was no room here to outrun consequence. While Edward's world contracted, Isabella's remained suspended. She lay in a hospital bed, still unconscious. Machines carrying the burden her body could not. Nurses spoke softly. Doctors monitored closely. Progress was uncertain. The waiting continued. Outside the facility, David and Michael worked without interruption. They met with prosecutors. They reviewed exhibits. They verified chains of custody. Every document was checked. Every timeline aligned. They did not rush. Precision mattered more than speed. Medical reports were finalized. Digital records were certified. Witness statements were signed. The file closed with completeness that left little room for argument. The date for trial was set. Edward was informed during morning count. The words were simple, the schedule firm. The moment landed with weight. There would be no quiet resolution, no private settlement. The story would be told in full. He was escorted back to his unit, the path familiar now. He felt smaller than before, not physically, but in the way the space seemed to close around him. The looks did not soften. The whispers did not stop. He sat on his bunk and stared at the wall, tracing cracks he had memorized. The panic returned sharper this time. He pressed his palms together, trying to slow his thoughts. Nothing answered. When the call came to prepare for transport, it did not feel like movement forward. It felt like a narrowing. Guards opened the door. His name was read. Instructions followed. He stood and complied. As he was led out, he passed faces he would not see again. Some watched. Some did not. No one spoke. Beyond the gate, a vehicle waited. The door opened. Edward stepped inside, the restraints familiar, the destination known. He did not look back. The place he was entering offered no retreat. The path ahead did not allow detours. The choices that remained would be made under lights on record, with witnesses present, and there would be no turning away. The courtroom opened to the public early that morning, benches filling steadily as observers took their seats. Reporters lined the back wall, notebooks, ready, cameras silent by order of the court. The atmosphere was restrained, heavy with expectation as the clerk called the session to order. Edward entered under escort, dressed in standard detention attire. The contrast between his former public image and his present state required no commentary. He kept his eyes forward and his hands still. Vanessa followed separately, seated with counsel as a secondary defendant. She avoided looking toward the gallery. The prosecutor stood and read the charges clearly and without flourish. The language was precise, grounded in statute and evidence. The allegations described a pattern of violence, abandonment, and deliberate concealment. Each count was entered into the record. Medical records were presented first. Screens displayed admission notes, injury assessments, and physician observations. The documentation was methodical. The injuries were consistent with force and inconsistent with an accidental fall. The pregnancy was addressed directly. The risk to both mother and child was established through clinical findings rather than opinion. Next came the digital evidence. Phone records appeared with timestamps aligned to the night in question. Calls, placed and deleted messages recovered through backups were shown in sequence. Financial transfers were traced to accounts connected to Vanessa. The timing mattered. The pattern mattered. Together, they illustrated coordination rather than coincidence. As the presentation continued, the concealment became unmistakable. Disabled cameras at the residence. The precise window during which recording ceased. The immediate relocation. The absence from the hospital. Each decision formed a link. The chain was visible to anyone watching. Thomas Reed was called to the stand. He took the oath and spoke plainly. He described returning to the house, finding Isabella unconscious, and seeing signs that alarmed him immediately. He stated that Edward was not present. He testified to the decision to call emergency services and to follow the ambulance to the hospital. His account was steady and consistent. On cross-examination, the defense attempted to suggest uncertainty. Thomas answered without embellishment. He did not speculate. He repeated what he had seen and what he had done. The effort to undermine his credibility failed to create doubt. A physician testified next. The doctor explained the injuries in clinical terms, avoiding emotional language. The testimony addressed force timing and the medical indicators of trauma in a pregnant patient. The conclusion was careful and firm. The injuries reflected violence against a pregnant woman. Edward did not testify. When his counsel questioned witnesses, the responses aligned with the evidence already entered. No alternative explanation held. No contradiction created space. Edward remained silent, his posture rigid, his expression unchanged. Vanessa was called briefly. She hesitated at first. When confronted with records and timelines, her statements shifted. Finally, she lowered her head and acknowledged her role in concealing information after the incident. The admission was quiet. The impact was not. The panel withdrew to deliberate. The courtroom settled into stillness. No one spoke. Even the press remained seated, waiting. Edward stared at the table before him. Vanessa clasped her hands together. Minutes passed without movement. Then the panel returned. The room remained silent as the judge took the bench. Papers were arranged. The clerk stood ready. The judge looked out across the courtroom, acknowledging the gravity of the proceedings. The record was complete. The evidence had been considered. The matter stood ready for resolution. No sound broke the air as the court prepared to speak. The judge returned to the bench, and the courtroom rose together. The movement was slow and unified, as if everyone understood the weight of what was about to be spoken. When the room settled again, silence held. No papers rustled. No one whispered. The verdict was read clearly. Edward was found guilty on all counts related to severe violence against a pregnant woman. The language was direct and final. The court addressed the harm inflicted, the abandonment that followed, and the deliberate efforts to conceal responsibility. Each point was supported by evidence already entered into the record. The sentence followed without delay. Edward was sentenced to 30 years of incarceration. There were no qualifiers and no reductions announced. The term reflected the seriousness of the crime and the risk it posed to both mother and child. The judge emphasized accountability and protection. The decision did not invite interpretation. Next came the financial consequences. The court ordered the full seizure of Edward's assets. Properties, accounts, and controlling interests were transferred under legal authority. Ownership rights were reassigned to Isabella. The ruling was specific and enforceable. The intent was restitution and security, not symbolism. Vanessa's case was addressed separately. The court acknowledged her role in concealing information after the incident. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation. 500 hours of community service were imposed. She would not serve time in custody. The terms were strict and monitored. The judge warned that any violation would result in immediate penalties. As the decisions were announced, reporters recorded every word. Updates spread quickly beyond the courtroom. Headlines formed in real time. Public attention focused on the sentence and the scope of the consequences. The case moved from allegation to conclusion in a single morning. Edward stood as the bailiff approached. His hands were secured, and he was escorted toward the exit. He did not look back. Cameras captured the moment as he passed through the doors. The image marked the end of his public standing. Authority reduced to procedure. Vanessa remained seated for several seconds after the court adjourned. When she stood, her composure faltered. She covered her face and began to cry, the sound delayed and unsteady. The reaction came too late to change anything. Court officers guided her away without comment. David and Michael remained in their seats until the room began to clear. They did not celebrate. They did not speak. Their focus was elsewhere. Isabella was still unconscious. The verdict did not alter her condition. Outside the courtroom, statements were brief. David confirmed that the family respected the ruling. Michael stated that their priority remained Isabella's recovery and protection of her rights. They declined further questions. Back at the hospital, Isabella lay unchanged. Machines monitored her breathing and vital signs. Nurses adjusted settings quietly. Doctors reviewed charts and waited. The verdict did not reach her. The legal resolution existed apart from her awareness. Legal teams moved quickly after sentencing. Asset transfers were initiated. Protective orders were reinforced. Documentation was filed to ensure Isabella's interests were secured regardless of her condition. David and Michael supervised each step. They requested confirmations. They verified timelines. Nothing was left assumed. Media coverage intensified through the afternoon. Analysts discussed the case. Commentators emphasized the importance of medical documentation and digital evidence. The narrative focused on accountability and consequence. No alternate explanation survived the record. Edward was transported to a correctional facility before nightfall. Processing was efficient. The sentence entered the system. There were no announcements and no delays. The door closed behind him and remained closed. Vanessa met with her attorney later that day. Conditions of probation were reviewed. Reporting requirements were explained. The weight of her admissions settled in. There would be no return to anonymity. Compliance would define her future. As evening approached, the hospital remained calm. David sat near Isabella's bed. Michael stood at the window. Neither spoke. The work was not finished. Preparations for appeal began immediately, not to challenge the verdict, but to protect against future interference. The brothers anticipated resistance. They ensured representation was secured and records preserved. The legal process would continue as long as necessary. The sound of a gavel echoed in memory, but the journey was not complete. Justice had been pronounced. Enforcement had begun. Healing had not. Isabella remained asleep, unaware that the law had moved decisively in her name. The system had spoken. The path ahead narrowed into care, vigilance, and waiting. Isabella woke slowly, not with panic, but with a cautious awareness of light and sound. The room was quiet, steady, familiar in a way she had not known for weeks. When she opened her eyes, David was seated beside her bed, and Michael stood near the window. Neither spoke at first. They waited until her gaze focused and her breathing settled. A doctor explained what had happened in careful terms. The coma had ended. Her condition was stable. Recovery would take time. Isabella listened without interrupting, absorbing each sentence as if placing it gently into order. When the doctor finished, David told her about the trial. He spoke plainly. Edward had been convicted. The sentence was final. The court had acted fully. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment. She did not ask for details. Knowing the outcome was enough. In the days that followed, legal matters were resolved without requiring her presence. Ownership documents were executed and transferred. Accounts were secured. Properties were reassigned. Everything that had been placed under the court's authority was returned to her control through lawful process. David and Michael attended the appellate hearing on her behalf. The ruling was upheld without modification. Edward's sentence stood. Isabella focused on her body. Physical therapy began slowly. Sitting up, standing with assistance, short walks down the hallway. Each movement carried effort, but each step forward mattered. The doctors monitored her closely and adjusted plans as needed. Progress came in increments rather than leaps. The child was safe, protected, monitored. Isabella was told repeatedly and believed it each time a little more. Relief did not arrive all at once. It grew steadily, replacing fear with certainty. When she was discharged, Isabella left the hospital quietly. There were no cameras and no statements. She wore simple clothes and leaned lightly on David's arm as they stepped into daylight. The air felt different outside, less enclosed, more real. She did not return to the house. A new residence had been arranged, chosen for privacy rather than prestige. Isabella moved there with support and without ceremony. She unpacked only what she needed. The rest could wait. The past did not require sorting. Edward began serving his sentence far from public view. His name faded from headlines as other stories replaced it. Inside the facility, time followed rules he did not set. The authority he once wielded no longer existed. His punishment was not symbolic. It was lived daily. Vanessa reported for community service as ordered. She worked in silence. No interviews followed her. No audience observed. The terms were strict and enforced. She complied. Thomas Reed continued to provide testimony where required. His role did not end with the verdict. He answered questions. He confirmed records. He did not seek recognition. He remained steady in his commitment to the truth. Isabella chose a future defined by restraint and intention. She limited contact. She avoided public discussion. Healing required space, not explanation. Therapy addressed both body and mind. Progress was measured by regained confidence rather than speed. Fear loosened its hold gradually. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, but they no longer dictated her choices. She learned to recognize strength without forcing it. Survival did not require spectacle. David and Michael remained close. They did not hover, but they stayed available. Their work shifted from defense to support. The legal battle was complete. Protection remained. One morning, Isabella stood at the window and watched sunlight reach across the floor. The day did not feel victorious. It felt possible. That was enough. Justice had done its work. The law had spoken clearly. What remained was living. The future did not erase what had happened. It did not need to. It allowed space beyond it. Dawn rose not for power reclaimed, but for a life preserved.